Okay, so here we go with the first real lecture, content-based lecture of the semester. And so the way this is going to look is I will start off usually on an outline page like this, and then we'll kind of move back and forth, not too many times, but we'll move back and forth between this and the textbook. And so when I talk about a new share, I'm usually going to switch between the whiteboard and the textbook. So this is what it looks like when I go to the text. Okay? And this lecture will be relatively light, sort of light. We're talking about chapter 1, sections 1, 2, and 3. I should have read these sections before you come to this. So this little discussion of what's there in the textbook should feel pretty comfortable for you. Okay. And so in 1.1, it talks about, well, biology is the study of life after all, but how do you recognize life? What are the characteristics of life? And it gives a nice little discussion of the characteristics of life include order, reproduction, growth, development, response to the environment, energy processing, regulation, and evolutionary adaptation, right? And this is all the context of a dramatic history. I would add on to this an evolutionary history spanning roughly 3.5 billion years. I mean, pretty much in order for you to sit here today, you have had to have enjoyed an unending string of success at reproduction and survival from the time that you were basically nothing more than a bacterial cell. It's kind of weird to think about it. You have basically emerged from a long streak of big wins. Your ancestors have all survived and reproduced, and in the process of being so successful, they have become ordered, able to respond to the environment, effective at processing energy, and also effective at regulation. So it's all these characteristics we see in life are not only characteristics of life, but they have been shaped by the long history of evolutionary change since life began. All right. If you want more on that, more on the topic of the general narrative of all life on Earth, maybe you might consider taking BIO102 at some point in the future. That's kind of like the main class that I teach. Okay, so yeah, read through this. I mean, we will be covering most of these kind of things in greater detail, in greater depth. Let me move on to the second portion of this, because this is the portion that might represent something that could be a little bit new for you, right? And so we are going to be making some very biology-specific descriptions, and we'll be talking about different kinds of cells. And I guess the thing that you will be noting here on this particular one is that we've got 3 domains: domain bacteria, domain archaea. That's how you say it, archaea, archaea, right? Bacteria, I'm sure you could pronounce eukarya, domain eukarya. The third domain, eukarya, right? I'm not going to give you these pronunciation guides, but I do want you to get in the habit of saying the words out loud, because, I know for a fact that biology students are often looking at words and saying, oh yeah, that word. Oh yeah, that word, right? And sooner or later, you're going to have to pronounce these things, okay? And so the thing about this is we've got these 2 domains, bacteria and archaea, that are both prokaryotic. That one's a pretty straightforward one to pronounce. It's very phonetic. And so the 2 domains of life, these are basically different kinds of cellular organisms that are not terribly closely related to each other. Bacteria or bacteria, archaea or archaea, eukaryotes or eukaryotes. Okay? we tend to make these divisions between the different kinds of cells. Um, it, we tend to care largely about the eukarya because that's the domain that we belong to. So let me scroll up a little bit, and we can look at the four main categories of eukaryotic cells, right? And so get back to my drawing mode. The protista is the one group that's really not a kingdom, right? It's actually just a little kind of a garbage can grouping. Anything that's eukaryotic that is not a plant, kingdom Plantae, a fungus, kingdom Fungi, or an animal, kingdom Animalia. Okay, anything that's eukaryotic but not one of those three major kingdoms is going to be classified in the protista, right? And so the protista would include things like amoebae. Algae are also not true plants. Algae are plant-like in the sense that they're photosynthetic, but there are plenty of things that belong in the protista that might be kind of unfamiliar to you. I think that most people are familiar with, well, what a plant is. You can check that off, kind of smile to yourself. Fungi, we know something about them, but mostly we know about the animals because after all, that is the kingdom to which we belong. That's where we classify. Okay. Now let's get back to my other share because I will be making reference to the whiteboard here. And so let's check off that we're okay on thinking about this. Characteristics of life. What does it mean that things are ordered, right? Can you sort of give a description of order? Oh, by order we mean predictability. It's not chaotic, right? Chaos is the opposite of order. And so if you look at any living organism, it's very much not chaotic. Things have to be in the right place. You have to do the right things at the right time. If you don't have that kind of predictability and orderliness, you don't get a living system, right? As things progress from order into chaos, that's kind of like what describes what happens after death, right? Decomposition. The body is converted into kind of random molecules that scatter across the atmosphere. Yeah, that would be the loss of order, whereas the opposite, generating real living cells, real living organisms and multicellular structures, that is definitely a pretty good characteristic of order, right? Okay. A reproduction thing, you know what that means, growth and development. You know what growth is. Development is basically the sequence of changes that occur during an individual's lifespan. Okay? So if you think of like a fertilized egg, or as we call it a zygote. Okay, fertilized egg is basically the first stage in the existence of a particular genome, right? And the fertilized egg is going to develop into an embryo. It's going to develop into a newborn. It's going to develop into a juvenile. It's going to develop into an adult. It's going to develop into an old geezer, and eventually it dies as a result. So basically, all the changes that we're seeing here, right, from fertilized egg through embryo through newborn, okay, those are all changes that would count as developmental changes, right? And this is actually one form of change that's not evolutionary, right? We think of evolutionary changes, things that happen over generations, right? A population can evolve, but what's happening over the lifespan of an individual undergoes changes and it develops. Okay? Response to the environment, your ability to respond appropriately to the environment. It could be behavioral. If you feel like you're getting cold, you respond by putting on a jacket. If you feel like you're hungry, you respond by eating, right? Energy processing basically is that you meet your energetic needs by eating, or if you're a plant, you acquire energy through photosynthesis. Regulation homeostasis is an important one. This is a one where we think of how it's kind of like how that order is maintained. For example, if your body temperature were to fluctuate wildly, you would not be as successful in surviving as you are as a perfectly homeothermic animal, right? You keep your body temperature right there close to 37, 38 degrees at all times, day and night, year in and year out, right? If you were to go up much above that, if you were to go to like the 40-degree range, you would be in severe danger of dying from whatever, your physiology is put at risk. If your temperature drops much below like 35 degrees, then you go into hypothermia, right? So the temperature is a good example of that. We can talk about regulation of pH. The general word that we say used to describe how we maintain a relatively equal steady state despite changes in the outside world, the word homeostasis means keeping everything the same in spite of fluctuations from the outside. Okay? Adaptation, right? How is your anatomy and physiology, how does your anatomy and physiology make you well suited to whatever it is that you need to do in your ecology, right? And so this applies to every living organism. The characteristics of a fruit fly are particularly good at doing what a fruit fly does, because that's how fruit flies have been successful in surviving and making new fruit flies over their relatively recent, the last 10 million years or so history. Okay. And so, yeah, I mean, at some point, do go through these, check them off one at a time, make sure that you can give examples of each and every one of these characteristics of life. Right? The three domains of life, remember, we had two prokaryotic domains, which were the bacteria and the archaea. And then you had the eukarya, which had four groups in it, the protista, which was not a real kingdom, but then we had the animals, the plants, and the fungi as the three legitimate kingdoms within the eukarya. Okay. Now, when we go to chapter 1, section 3, it talks about, it gives you a nice little diagram that illustrates the different levels of organization that we find in biological systems. Right? You can start way over on the left-hand side with biosphere, but I like to start in the middle, because if we think about biological systems, right there in the middle, we know that every living organism is made of a cell, right? And you can go bigger, we can go smaller, right? And so, for example, if you take a cell, break it into smaller units, you'd have organelles. Organelles can be broken into biological molecules. And I think that's kind of like where the textbook leaves off. You can go smaller than that. You can go to atoms. You can go to subatomic particles. We'll even be talking about subatomic particles really soon in our discussion of Bio 110 content, right? So that's taking things in the smaller direction, making things, basically you can study cells by looking at them from the perspective of how their organelles are composed. You can study organelles by dissecting the organelles apart into their component biological molecules. Right? You can go bigger. You can say cells in a multicellular organism are organized into tissues. Tissues are organized into organs, organs into organ systems. And then we've got the multicellular organism. Okay. This is the fish in the diagram from 1.3. And then you could make things even bigger. You talk about the population of fish, and you could talk about the community that fish belongs to. Then that might belong to the ecosystem, and that might belong to the biosphere. And so you go from one level, most inclusive, down to the smallest level. And that's all, I think, pretty straightforward and understandable. What thing I want to pay attention to here are that we're kind of sneaking in two important concepts, right? One is the hierarchy, and the other one is the emergent property. And both of these things work their way into the title of 1.3 or somewhere along the lines, because it talks about the hierarchy of life, right? Now, hierarchy is actually a pretty easy concept, right? A hierarchy says that, well, within one organism, okay, say a fish, you actually have several different organ systems, right? You've got a digestive system, a nervous system, excretory system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, you can break a fish down into its component organ systems, and these organ systems are all subsidiary to the larger organism, right? A digestive system belongs to only one fish, right? The fish has its components, and the components belong to that fish, and that's why we've got organ systems nested within organism, right? Then if you look at at any one of these systems, digestive system, you might have organs like stomach, intestine, a gallbladder, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so, yeah, a gallbladder belongs to the digestive system, but it does not belong to the nervous system, right? And again, you've got organs nested within the next unit up, which would be organ system. And you could say, well, a stomach consists of several different kinds of tissues. Tissues consist of different kinds of cells. Cells are composed of organelles. So the concept of a hierarchy is kind of like where you've got, well, here is like one nested unit. You've got several other nested units below that. Okay, so this might be the organism, and these might be the organ systems, right? And within the organ system, you might have different organs. This might be one organ within the digestive system. This might be another one. And within each of these, you continue to break things down smaller and smaller. And that's what we mean by a hierarchy, right? It's kind of similar to the ranks in the military, right? You would have a really large unit under the command of this officer, and then within that you would have subgroupings, each one having its own commander, and within that, each one of these you would have a lower level commander, and so you would have levels of rank in which the degrees of responsibility get ever greater as you go up the hierarchy, or ever more puny as you go down the hierarchy, right? So that's the concept of a hierarchy. The last thing that we want to talk about is the concept of an emergent property, right? And here's where we're going to go back to our regular share. Okay, so we'll be moving into the next section of the chapter. New properties emerge at each level, right? And so it kind of describes what an emergent property is. And here's where it is, right? So I'm going to annotate this. It's going to last for very long. Novel properties, oops, in a second, undo that. I was supposed to do a highlighter. Novel properties arise at each level, properties that were not present at the preceding level, right? So I like to think, if you think about, well, what can a cell do? Does a cell have properties that are not there if you look at different kinds of organelles? Well, yeah, I mean, a cell is basically a unit of life, right? A cell would have order, it would have ability to reproduce, so it would have an ability to regulate, it would have some adaptation ability to process energy. If you look at all those characteristics of life, you can see them at the level of the cell, but you don't necessarily see them at the level of the organelle, right? The subcomponents that go into a cell. And as it says here, these emergent properties require a specific arrangement and interactions between the component parts. The organelles have to interact with each other exactly right in order for us to get these properties of life that we see at the level of the cell. And so this is a really key buzzword. And this is one of the things that makes biological systems so interesting, okay? Because in other kinds of hierarchical systems, we don't get these emergent properties as clearly as we do in biological systems. And, we don't effectively get them at all, right? If you think about a rock, okay, and a rock is composed of maybe grains of sand, maybe it's a piece of sandstone, right? Granules of stuff. Or is a rock doing anything in particular that you can't really imagine happening, knowing that the rock is composed of a whole bunch of granules? No, you're not. I mean, this might be an example of a hierarchical nesting. Granules nest within rock, but we certainly don't see a whole lot happening at the level of rock that you couldn't predict from the properties that we have at the level of the granules, right? And so, biological systems have these emergent properties coming out. And as a biologist, I mean, once you really think biologically, you'll realize that this is kind of a really important and also really interesting and fascinating and awesome characteristic of biological systems. Okay, that's it for this lecture. More next time. See you soon.